what I hope to do this evening is to share with you the fascinating story of this remarkable early Bronze Age hoard found 121 years ago at Migdale in Sutherland, one of the most important finds from Highland region, with wide ramifications, as you can see from my title. I'm going to start by describing how, where and by whom the hoard was found, then what is actually in the hoard, what then happened to it, and what people made of it, both at the time and later on in the 20th century. I'll then go on to say what we can now say about the hoard with the benefit of our greater knowledge and the analytical techniques that have been applied to it. And I'll also try to explain why it was buried, why it's such an important find, and what it tells us about the person who originally owned these precious artifacts and the society in which that person lived. And I'll end up by saying a very little bit about the other archaeological sites in the area, particularly those which were excavated by Time Team. Remember that TV program, folks? Way, way back in 2003. So let's get started with where, how, and by whom the hoard was found. An initial summary account of the discovery was published in 1901 in volume 35 of the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland by Joseph Anderson, who was the keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland. When Andrew Carnegie, the philanthropist on whose Skibo estate the hoard was found, exhibited the finds to that society. According to Anderson's account, the Reverend Jose of Golspie told him that it had been found while blasting the top of a granite knoll situated on the moor at the west end of Loch Migdale in the parish of Crich. It's not far from Bona Bridge, whose position you can see in the satellite view on the right. This account said that there are two prehistoric hut circles 200 yards northeast of the knoll, and all around, but at a greater distance away, there are many tumuli and cairns. We recognise those as being field clearance cairns, probably of Bronze Age date. More precise details of the find spot and the find circumstances have only come to light within the last 20 years, thanks firstly to sleuthing by Sarah Horn, who published her Peek into the Past account of records of Bona Bridge in 2003, which included a clip from the Highland News dating to when the hoard was discovered. And secondly, to an interview that Stuart Ainsworth of the Time Team carried out with Marion Fraser, who had been taken up to the find spot when she was a girl. Moreover, following the transmission of the Time Team programme in early 2004, Margaret Thompson of Ospisdale Organic Farm passed further information about the find to Valerie Mackenzie Harris of the Kyle of Sutherland Historical Society. As how it was discovered and by whom, the clip from the Highland News of the 5th of May 1900 states, under the heading Interesting Finds, while the workmen in the employ of Mr. Macpherson, mason contractor, were blasting some boulders of granite at Migdale for the buildings now being erected at Bona Bridge for Messrs. Paulson and Mackenzie, they discovered in their excavations caused by the blasting operations a splendidly preserved axe head and several flint arrowheads, and also 6 bronze wristlets and 2 anklets. Other articles of personal adornment were also found. So that's who'd done it, and it's likely that the granite would have been used to make door and/or fireplace lintels. But where were they blasting? This is where things get a bit complicated. We know it was on a knoll on high ground overlooking Loch Migdale, not far from 2 hut circles and in an area with lots of field clearance cairns. What's so interesting about what Marion Fraser said is that the find spot, as recorded in Canmore, the National Sites and Monuments Database, and in the Highland Historical Environment records, is over a mile away to the east of where she reported being taken, as you can see on this map. Marion stated that the find spot is on Tulloch Hill, past Carn an Wittich towards Culnara, and this tallies with the view shown in a watercolour that was painted around the time of the discovery and which looks across to Loch Migdale. And I'm sorry that it's a bit fuzzy, this was a screenshot. The caption to this refers to the hoard's discovery in May 1900 in a weathered joint of a granite knoll, and it mentions the 2 hut circles nearby and the many tumuli and cairns in the area. When Stuart Ainsworth investigated the Tulloch Hill area for the Time Team programme in 2003, he wasn't able to do an exhaustive search for knolls that had been blasted. And sadly, Marion Fraser is no longer with us. But he did find rocky knolls, hut circles, and numerous field clearance cairns. And it would certainly be well worthwhile somebody returning to that area when it's not covered in bracken to check for signs of blasting for stone quarrying. With the location as recorded by Canmore and the Highland HER, it's based on notes on Ordnance Survey cards that record a Mr. N. Stewart of Migdale had indicated an area of rocky knolls where he'd heard that something had been found. In the area of those knolls marked on the map, there is indeed evidence for extensive stone quarrying, and 1 or 2 shot holes were found in the rock for where you'd put the explosive. And this would tally with the activities as described in the Highland News, but there aren't any traces of the hut circles nearby, as mentioned by the Reverend Jose. So the plot thickens. But one nugget of useful information comes from the watercolour, where it records that the hoard was found within a weathered joint or crevice on the knoll. And this suggests that the workmen may have come across it when they were laying explosives, as otherwise the hoard would indeed have been blasted to smithereens. Find spot. What actually was found? Well, if we look at the photograph that was published by Joseph Anderson in 1901, when Andrew Carnegie, dubbed the richest man in the world, exhibited the hoard to the distinguished fellows of that society, we see 2 flat axe heads of bronze. I'm putting my cursor where they are. Around 40 tubular sheet bronze beads with wooden stiffeners inside them. An embossed strip of bronze, which you can just about see here, bottom right. A fragment of a second, 4 sheet bronze cones, one of which was broken into 2 bits, 6 V-perforated buttons of black material, which Anderson referred to as jet, a pair of bronze basket-shaped ornaments, bottom there, bottom left, that seem to have been flattened out, a pair of ribbed bangles or anklets, which is these 2 here, there, that one there, and that one there, and also a set of 2 sets of 3 bangles subtly graded in size. We shall see better photographs of each of these objects in a moment. Also shown in this photo at the top right and left corners are a scraper of chert and a scraper of flint that were found, along with a couple of fragments of chert and a piece of an agate pebble that were found on or near the knoll. These other things aren't shown in the photo. Also found nearby and not shown is a spindle whorl for hand spinning thread. None of these stone objects was connected with the hoard. But was that all that was found in the hoard? And is there any information about whether the objects had been in a container? Well, this is where the information that was passed to Valerie Mackenzie Harris by the late Margaret Thompson in 2004 is so valuable. Margaret was the daughter of Lord Migdale, Lord Lieutenant of Sutherland, and she reported that the objects had been found in a bag of cloth or leather, which disintegrated, scattering the beads. Whether it had actually been a bag, as opposed to a garment, is unknown. Her father, Lord Migdale, offered £1 per bead to the local community, and it's believed that not all the beads that were found were actually passed to him, and so it's quite possible that some are still out there in the community. So if you do have any, please do the right thing and let me or my colleague, Dr. Matt Knight at National Museum Scotland or the Treasure Trove Unit know. Anyone knows anything about the second flat bronze axe head seen at the top of this 1901 photo, we'd love to hear. It wasn't among the objects that ended up in the collections of the then named National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, when they were first lent in 1956, then donated in 1965 to that museum by Mrs. Roswell Miller, Andrew Carnegie's daughter. And in the Canmore and the HER records, echoing the Highland News item, it states that only 1 axe head was found. And yet Joseph Anderson clearly stated there were 2, and Andrew Carnegie exhibited 2. Was this an extraneous axe head that had been found in the area and shown along with the hoard, or was it an integral part of the hoard? That's just one of the outstanding mysteries of Migdale, And if anyone can shed any light on the matter, that would be great. Perhaps lurking in the enormous Carnegie archives, there's a document that tells all. Anyway, people were very excited by the discovery, and they also had their ideas as to what the objects were used for. The Highland News fancifully described the beads as a collection of arrow feather holders, presumably thinking that the fletching feathers would be stored by sticking their ends into the beads. The mind boggles. But a different interpretation of the beads as being from a necklace was in the mind of Joseph Anderson in 1901, and you can see by the way he's laid them out. And this idea persisted for the whole of the 20th century, as indeed we can see from Robert Stevenson's reconstruction that he published in 1956, shortly after Mrs. Roswell Miller had deposited the hoard on loan to the then named National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland. Robert Anderson was the museum's keeper, and he carried out a thorough study of the hoard, noting that the tubular sheet bronze beads were very well made and highly polished, and seemed to be graded into 5 size categories. He thought they could have belonged to a spacer plate necklace, like the ones in jet that were strung up this particular way until it was realised in the 1980s that this arrangement was actually wrong. The embossed bronze object seems to be the cover for a wooden spacer plate to keep the strands of beads separate. This idea that the beads and the spacer plate could be from a necklace persisted for the rest of the 20th century, being cited as such in the catalogue that accompanied David Clarke's Symbols of Power at the Time of Stonehenge exhibition in 1985. That wonderful exhibition was the occasion for a detailed re-examination of the hoard by my NMS colleague Trevor Cowie. Moving on to what we now can say about the objects in the hoard, in the light of advances and analyses over the last quarter century, it's clear that there's a lot more that can be said. Let's start with the flat bronze axe head that made it into the National Museum collections. It's highly likely to have been made in the area, as we know that Migdale was a centre of early Bronze Age metalworking at the time. I'll be saying more about this in a few minutes. The copper in the axe head will have been imported from southwest Ireland, where a copper mine at Ross Island in County Kerry had been in operation since around 2400 BC. And the tin that was alloyed with the copper to make bronze will almost certainly have come from Cornwall. The most remarkable feature of this axe head is that its surface had been deliberately enriched with tin, which would have made it look silvery. And here's another example of a tinned Migdale type axe head from Fife. The tin is oxidised to a dull grey colour, but when it was new, it would have shone brilliantly. Tin was an incredibly precious material at the time, and so the makers of these tinned axe heads were making a huge statement about their wealth and their ability to procure and use considerable amounts of this exotic material, which had been imported in the form of tin ingots from several hundred kilometres away in southwest England. Impressive stuff indeed. Let's turn now to the bangles or armlets. They're of bronze, made from they're D-shaped and oval rods of bronze, which had been bent round and their ends were butted together. And you can see one example where the ends had come apart. These too are likely to have been locally made, possibly in a stone mould like the one you see here found at Glenrinnes in Banffshire. They seem to be 2 sets of 3, and they are subtly graded in size, ranging in diameter from about 72 to 81 millimetres. There are several other finds of contemporary early Bronze Age bar bangles from elsewhere in Scotland, as here at Crawford in South Lanarkshire, and further afield in Britain. But what Trevor Cowie was able to say was that when the Migdale bangles were worn on the arm, each set of 3 would have closely resembled the spiral bronze armlets that were all the rage in Central Europe, would you believe, between 2200 and 2000 BC, in the Straubing culture cemeteries of Bavaria and neighbouring areas. You can see one example here that's still wrapped around the remains of somebody's arm. So it does look as though continental fashions were being emulated at Migdale, amazingly enough. Also present was this pair of embossed bronze items, which could have been armlets or equally could have been anklets. They're around 73 millimetres in diameter, so they're comparable to the smaller of the bar bangles. Jewellery like this is very rare in early Bronze Age Scotland and in Britain more widely, and where there are parallels, they are assumed to be armlets. That's the case with this example, shown in this rather poor engraving, that was found in a stone kist grave at Williamston in the old county of Perthshire, where the excavator inferred from its position in the kist that it had been on the deceased's arm. It's also the case, by inference, for a magnificent pair of embossed sheet bronze items found with a jet and cannel coal spacer plate necklace at Melfort in Argyll, of which only this one made it into our museum. The embossed design is in the shape of the fusiform jet beads in the necklace, and we know that parures of matching necklaces and bracelets were worn by high-status early Bronze Age women. And finally, that's the same is true again for this pair, with a similar embossed bead design that was found in a large, high-status his and hers kist at Masterton in Fife. And finally, there's this magnificent pair made from embossed sheet gold that was found at Lockington in Leicestershire. Going back to the Migdale ones, we don't know whether all of the jewellery and dress accessories in the hoard would have been worn together, or indeed by the same person, but if they were, there would have been space to wear them below the pseudo-spiral armlets on the wrist, or equally, they would have looked great around the ankles. I mentioned before that the bar bangles evoked Central European early Bronze Age fashion, and that's very much the case too, with the tubular sheet bronze beads, cones and spacer plate cover from the hoard. While the cones evoke the shape of early Bronze Age V-perforated buttons, even though no example in metal has been found elsewhere in Britain as far as I know, there's no parallel in Britain for the spacer plate cover. And here you see a fragment of a second one here, although the embossed design is indeed similar to the one on the Migdale and Masterton bangles, and the use of spacer plates is well known from the early Bronze Age jet necklaces, as we've noted before. Parallels for the tubular sheet bronze beads are incredibly rare in Britain, although one or possibly two examples recently turned up in an early Bronze Age cemetery at Kilmagadwood in Perth and Kinross, buried in a cordoned urn, along with the cremated remains of a young adult, probably female. This is likely to be slightly later than the Migdale beads, possibly dating to around 1750 BC. 1990s, I was able to get a radiocarbon date from the willow stiffener in one of the Migdale beads, and the result came out at between 2282 and 1777 BC, with a 2/3 chance that it lies within the bracket 2139 to 1934. And that's a good early Bronze Age date. The most striking thing about the Migdale sheet bronze items is that they can be paralleled a very long way away in the Straubing culture cemeteries in and around southern Bavaria in Central Europe, as you can see from this old picture of finds from the eponymous cemetery. On the continent, the conical items are known as tutuli, and they occur both in sheet bronze form and in spiral form made from wire. Recent radiocarbon dating of examples of both of these artifact types from southern Bavaria has shown that these were indeed contemporary with the Migdale items. As for how these were deployed, the evidence from Straubing shows that they are associated with women, and the fact that they are found around the head strongly suggests that they were attached to some fancy kind of headdress. Now, I can't unfortunately find a decent reconstruction image for a Straubing culture headdress, but this later example from the Lüneburger Heide, the Lüneburg Heath in northern Germany, nearer to 1300 BC in date, shows how very striking such headgear would have looked. And this also makes me wonder whether the cloth or animal skin bag in which the beads were reportedly found might instead have been a piece of headgear. It's quite possible, but we'll never know. I'll explain in a moment why the late Victor Ambros's fine reconstruction drawing done for the Time Team programme shows it being worn by a man. Let's move on now to the last few items from the hoard. And here we have a pair of flattened out bronze objects, which would originally have been basket shaped, rather like this wonderful gold example from Orbliston in Murray, which was one of a pair that was found in ballast from railway construction. And the find spot was also where a gold lunula had been found. Now, traditionally, these objects, which are, the earliest ones are known, they date to about 2450 BC. So they start in the Chalcolithic. They're one of the beaker novelties that came over from continental Europe, but they clearly continued through in use to the early Bronze Age. Formerly, they were thought to have been earrings, but actually, as any woman could tell you, if you're going to be unfurling it and putting it back in your ear, the tang is going to break off. And it seems much more likely that these were actually basket-shaped hair ornaments, rather like luxurious scrunchies. And again, that's how they've been shown on the reconstruction diagram here. And finally, what are the 6 perforated buttons, V-perforated buttons? Well, these are a well-known early Bronze Age artifact type, and compositional analysis of the Migdale ones by my colleague Dr. Mary Davis established that these aren't made of Whitby jet, unlike many other such buttons in Britain, but instead they're of cannel coal or shale. So in theory, they could have been made within the region. We don't think that they used local Brora shale to make them, though, but more research would be needed to pin down the source of this material. There are quite a few finds of V-perforated buttons in Scotland, including this splendid set from Harehope in Peeblesshire. Work by the late great Ian Shepherd established that while the normal-sized ones tend to be unisex, being used by both men and women, the large ones, like the one that you see at the back, are only associated with men and were probably used to fasten an outer cloak. Ian also pointed out that sets of 6 buttons, like this set from Rameldry Farm in Fife from a dagger grave, are also a male association used to fasten a jacket. The Rameldry buttons were indeed found with the skeleton of a man who was not a local, I have to say. And amazingly, they include one button that was made of lizardite from Cornwall, several hundred kilometres away. The others are of Whitby jet, and one was uniquely decorated by selectively dulling the polished surface and inlaying grooves with metallic tin, which, when new, would have looked absolutely spectacular, just like this. And again, the tin will have come from Cornwall. The other amazing thing about the Rameldry buttons is that while some of them were obviously quite old, one was brand new. And it's almost as though the family realised that this VIP man was about to expire, and they had to sort of ring or fax down to Whitby, or the early Bronze Age equivalent, i.e. sail down to Whitby, to acquire a 6th one to complete the set that he had to have for his jacket. Anyway, all of this suggests to us that the Migdale buttons were the property of a man and had probably been attached to a jacket at some point in their use lives. So if you put it all together and take a flight of fancy, as telefolks are wont to do, you end up with this magnificent envisioning by the late great Victor Ambrus of the Migdale hoard as if in use. It assumes that all of the objects belong to a single person. The reason for showing it as a man is, as I've just explained, that the set of 6 buttons suggests a male association. Basket-shaped hair ornaments have also been found with men, including the famous Amesbury archer near Stonehenge, and his so-called companion, buried next to him, who is related to him. It could be argued, though with no particular evidence to back up the claim, that the axe heads are also a male association. But I've also pointed out that on the continent, tubular sheet bronze beads and cones are a female association. So are spiral armlets. But actually, would ordinary folks in Scotland have known that? No, of course not. I suspect this may be a case of where somebody has travelled to the continent, been blown away by what he saw as the latest fashions in Bavaria, and come home and got himself made a set of jewellery and dress accessories inspired buy that, which would really impress his peers, knowing that nobody else was in a position to go back to Bavaria to check up on who was wearing such stuff there. It's not the only example of this. In Ireland, so-called Tara Boy was buried with female grave goods. This may be a case of what anthropologist Mary Helms has described as cosmological acquisition, where certain members of the elite travel long distances and bring back exotic ideas or objects with them. And it's not the weirdest example. In a different cultural context, a chief in Papua New Guinea was photographed in the 1960s, I think, wearing a headdress that was made from the front of a Kellogg's cornflake packet, would you believe? Because this, in that context, would have been a very prestigious exotic item that had been brought to the island. Sadly, I wasn't able to find a photo of that in time for tonight. Let's now look at the context and significance of the hoard. Why was it deposited up on a hill overlooking Loch Migdale? And what does it tell us about the society at the time? Well, in answer to the first question, let's go back to that watercolour that was painted in 1900, shown here in black and white. It's believed that the knoll with the weathered joint crevice is on the left. By anyone's judgment, it's a spectacular location on a hill overlooking Loch Migdale and with the dramatic looming mountain in the background. In fact, it's characteristic for the location of deposition of a number of early Bronze Age hoards and individual objects, as research by Trevor Cowie in the Scotland in Ancient Europe book has shown. It's very likely that such places were believed to be numinous, associated with the world of the gods and ancestors, and perhaps imbued with their magical power. Indeed, as Professor Richard Bradley has recently pointed out in his reassessment of the Dalnacara axe head hoard, there was sometimes an archaeoastronomical element involved as well, with the find spot being directed towards the point on the horizon where the midwinter sun rose behind the Nevis Range. So it seems likely that the Migdale hoard of very precious and prestigious personal possessions, some of which had clearly seen some use, was not tucked down a crevice for safekeeping, although we can never completely rule that out as a possibility. Nor clearly was it a metalworker's stock in trade, cached in preparation for being melted down and reused. It's most likely to be a gift to the gods, deposited to ensure the good fortune of the owner and his family. As for the cultural milieu in which such an act took place, we are dealing with a time of great prosperity for this part of Highland Scotland, based on it being a centre of early Bronze Age metalworking that relied on the importation of copper from the Ross Island mine in southwest Ireland. And this copper probably came up the Great Glen from southwest Scotland. And it also relied on the importation of tin from Cornwall. And indeed, some of the metal that came up to the region from Ireland could well have been ready-made bronze. We know that axe heads and other bronze objects were being made here, as there are quite a few finds of stone moulds from northeast Scotland, such as this one from Strathconan. The dynamics of this industrial system have been brilliantly set out by Dr. Stuart Needham in his evocatively termed article, Migdale Marnock, Sunburst of Scottish Metallurgy, which was published in 2004 in that same Scotland in Ancient Europe volume, and I urge you all to read it, it's really good. And you can see from this map, his map, that Irish copper was being imported from as early as 2300 BC, before the beginning of the Bronze Age. Anyone who was able to control the flow of metal therefore had the opportunity to get rich quick. And we can see this happening in several grave assemblages from northeast Scotland and also from southwest Scotland, especially Kilmartin Glen. So, the man who was buried with these lavish grave goods at Culduffel on the outskirts of Inverness may well have been involved in the early metal trade, to use that term loosely, since isotopic analysis of his remains has shown that he wasn't a local, but had grown up on the Antrim Plateau. So he came from Ireland, but you would never guess that from his grave goods, which are bang on trend for British beaker assemblages. He was buried with a large beaker that could take over 4 litres of some kind of liquid sustenance for his journey into the other world. And ironically, when people have done lipid analysis of beaker pottery, they have found traces of milk. I mean, there's one beaker that may have had Ashgrove that may have had ale or mead in it, but I think we have to hope that the milk that was found in other beakers was fermented milk. Otherwise, it's rather too wholesome. Anyway, and this man at Culduffel was also buried with everything that he'd need when he got to the other world. A quiver full of fine arrowheads, or perhaps complete arrows. A flint striker light for making fire. A bone belt ring, possibly to keep his clothing from getting in the way of his bow. And an exquisite ornament for a wrist guard, made of tuff from Great Langdale in the Lake District of northwest England, which had been riveted to a hide wrist guard using copper rivets that were capped with gold. Absolutely impressive stuff. And if you want to find out more, my colleague Dr. Matt Knight at the museum has just uploaded a blog as part of Scottish Archaeology Month. Of course, Mr. Culduffel was by no means the earliest blow-in to Highland region. A few generations earlier, he was preceded by beaker-using immigrants from what is now the Netherlands, whose daughter or daughter's remains were found at Achavanich in Caithness, and were the subject of a major research project coordinated by Maya Hoole and published in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland recently. But I digress, back to the early Bronze Age. Here at Seafield West, again in Inverness, or on the outskirts, was found a pair of graves that strongly point to connections with Ireland. The canoe-shaped log coffin, which could actually have been a log boat, which would be useful for plying, sailing up and down the Great Glen, Loch Ness. This was found to contain a dagger made using Irish copper and probably Cornish tin. And this may well have been a man's grave. And right beside it was a rectangular timber chamber containing an Irish-style food vessel, the fashionable new pottery style of the early Bronze Age. This may well have been a woman's grave, and it's just a shame that the human remains didn't survive in either grave. And it may therefore be that Mr. and Mrs. Seafield West were entrepreneurs involved in the early Bronze Age metal trade, linking Ireland to northeast Scotland, as you can see here again. And to the south of the other end of the Great Glen, in Kilmartin Glen, we see a set of very rich and ostentatious graves dating to the same period, the early Bronze Age, around 2200 to 2000 BC. These include a series of exceptionally large round cairns. You can just about see, you can see Glebe cairn here, you can see another one there, another one there. There was something like 7 or 8 of these along the bottom of the valley. And these had large kists inside them where the elite were buried. Inside one of these at Netherlargy North, people had prized up a slab of bedrock with ancient cut marks on it. These would have been centuries old. And they'd then added carvings of their own, carvings of flat axe heads, before they used it as the capstone on the kist of a VIP. Probably somebody who was connected with controlling the flow of metal from Ireland to northeast Scotland. And indeed, in the latest volume of the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society is a wonderful article by Professor Richard Bradley and Aaron Watson, where they have looked in great detail at the Netherlargy North evidence. The strength of the Irish links is shown in the use of Irish-style food vessel pottery in the graves in Kilmartin Glen. So the one at the top, found in Glebe cairn, is one of the finest food vessels in the whole of Scotland, and it may well have been made by a potter who had come over from Ireland. And the one at the bottom from Upper Largy is a fascinating hybrid. The top part could well be, you could lose it in Ireland. It's a classic Irish form, but the stubby little legs are absolutely typical of Yorkshire food vessels. And this underlines the range of the external connections of Kilmartin Glen. So they were linked to Ireland, they were linked to North East Scotland, they were linked to Yorkshire. And they were supplying not only North East Scotland with Irish metal, but probably also North England. And we can also see this if we consider the density of finds of jet and jet-like spacer plate necklaces in southwest Scotland. These will have been made by specialist jet workers around Whitby in North Yorkshire and acquired for adorning high-status women. You can also see a corresponding, if smaller, cluster of jet spacer plate necklaces around the northeast end of the Great Glen. Returning to the early Bronze Age metalworking industry around Migdale, we can see that it flourished over several centuries. Here, for example, are two hoards of axe heads that were probably separated by several generations. The products of the so-called Migdale Munich metalworking industry travelled far and wide. And this is where the continental aspect of the Migdale story arguably comes in, as part of a wider story of British continental early Bronze Age links. Way down in the south of England, from around 2000 BC, a series of very rich early Bronze Age graves have been found. And I refer to the golden bling as they're rather like posh and becks. And it's thought that this wealth relates to the ability of these people to monopolise the flow of Cornish tin into the continent. The area around Stonehenge became the epicentre of new fashions, some clearly influenced from the continent, as we can see in the grave goods at Bush Barrow, close to Stonehenge, with their very strong connections with the elite of Brittany. And indeed, it's as though the VIPs, the elite of Wessex, were interacting with and probably related to the elite in Brittany. The VIP man who was buried here at Bush Barrow had daggers that are of Breton style and may well have been imported from Brittany. And likewise, within Brittany, there is evidence that the elite acquired precious objects from Britain, including a jet spacer plate from a necklace. Over time, over the course of the first half of the second millennium, the centre of power shifted to the Channel coast. As a Channel maritory, that is a sort of a maritime version of a territory, and that's a coin, very useful coin, that was termed by Stuart Needham. This Channel maritory developed with intensive toing and froing and movement of goods, with the process being oiled with the hospitality of elite diplomacy and the exchange of gifts, as we can see from these exquisite, precious drinking vessels of gold, amber and shale, and these continental-style dress pins that were found in southern England. Indeed, by 1550 BC, when the Dover boat was in operation, there was bulk transport of goods, especially metalwork, across the Channel, which may indeed have outstripped the current capability of our haulage industry. We know that axe heads from Ireland and Britain were reaching North and Central Europe by at least as early as 1900 BC, as is clear from these examples of Irish axe heads found in Denmark. And arguably the most spectacular example of export from Britain to the continent during the early Bronze Age is the so-called sky disc from Nebra, near Halle in Germany. And I urge you to go to the amazing regional museum in Halle. There's actually there's an exhibition at the moment all about the Nebra disc, and that exhibition will come to the British Museum in the new year. This disc shows the sun, the moon and the stars, and possibly a sunboat as well. And in painstaking analysis of the raw materials by German scholars, this has revealed that both the gold and the tin originated in the Carnan Valley in Cornwall. Spectacular stuff. And so it's within this world of long distance journeys and exchanges that our hypothetical Mr. Migdale fits in. We'll never know for sure whether he actually did travel to Central Europe, but it's quite possible that he did. He certainly participated in the vocabulary of esteem that was popular in Central Europe around the beginning of the third millennium. And luckily for us, he left behind a veritable treasure which, thank heavens, the stone blasters spotted before they could blast it into smithereens. I know that time's short now, but I did promise to say a very little bit about the other archaeological sites near the Migdale hoard, and in particular the ones excavated by Time Team in 2003. Three sites were dug: an Iron Age crannog, a mini henge, and an odd small cairn close to it. The crannog turned out to be a bog standard one, Iron Age crannog, with well-preserved timber, including a stake that produced a radiocarbon date of 40 BC to AD 140. So that's great. So it has nothing to do with the Migdale hoard. It's much later, but it's part of our Iron Age history of the region. As for the mini henge there, and the enigmatic small mound, this was a site that had actually been excavated in 1970 by Tony Woodham, and I'm pleased that the Time Team were able to get Tony to come and visit the site and to discuss what he had found. So he is the gentleman at the top left who is talking to Carenza Lewis. And he hadn't, the only artifacts that he'd found were bits of chipped quartz. And again, that's what the 2003 excavations turned up. And this quartz had deliberately been brought in. It may have featured in rituals, because if you strike quartz, it has this amazing piezoelectrical phenomenon where it sparks and it emits a green glow, particularly in the dark. But what the Time Team did find was that in slap bang in the middle of this site was a tiny little stone that was lying down, but when they lifted it up and they aligned it, they found that it actually aligned on where the sun would rise during the spring and autumn equinoxes, in a notch in the hills in the distance at the other end of Loch Migdale. Now, at the time, we gaily said, oh, yes, this is a small early Bronze Age henge, la, la, la. But luckily, as a result of work by Richard Bradley, which was published in his book called Stages and Screens, I don't know if you can see it, this is a book here, he pointed out that very small henges like this one tend to date towards the middle of the Bronze Age. So it's likely that this was built nearer to about 1500 BC. Unfortunately, there wasn't anything that was radiocarbon datable in it, but that it certainly tallies with the ceremonial activities that we know around 1500 BC in Highland region. And I said that close to this was a tiny little cairn of stones, and we excavated it in the hope of finding cremated remains. There weren't any human remains there at all, but what there was what we thought was the stump of a post, which had rotted in situ and then had been buried in this cairn of stones. And so it was excavated with great, ta-das. But unfortunately, Francis Pryor excavated, but unfortunately post-excavation revealed that no wood had survived, and that peat had actually filled in the socket left by what had been a squared off pole of wood. But it may well be that this too had been used for sighting on an astronomically significant phenomenon on the horizon. So all in all, and as you will certainly read when you read the Highland Archaeological Research Framework, the Highland region is incredibly rich in archaeological sites of all different periods. And I would say that Loch Migdale is one of the more interesting of the regions. So, as Mr. Migdale would say, thanks for listening. And if anyone